Heading south of the Mason-Dixon, this is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 325, covering the week of September 12th through September 16th, 2022. Glad to have you back on the program. Very glad to be here. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter, like our Gab page, and subscribe to our YouTube page. YouTube page is great. It's got all of our lectures, podcasts, a ton of stuff out there. Our Abbeville U videos, just a great resource, and it's all free on YouTube, right? But if you do like the stuff on YouTube, if you like the videos, click on that little super thanks button underneath. You can contribute to the Institute that way. Of course, if you go to abbevilleinstitute.org, that's Abbeville, institute.org, you can give us a donation there. Just click on the donate button. You can donate annually or a one-time gift or monthly, however you want to do it. But your donations are tax deductible to the full extent of the law, and you help keep this podcast free of charge. You help keep the website free of charge. You help keep all these things going, our conferences, our videos, all of that stuff, which does cost us money, you help contribute to. We exist on your generous contributions alone. If you like what we do, consider that. Also, you can go to abbevilleacademy.org. It's where we have all of our old webinars housed. So if you've missed any of the webinars, we have over a dozen up there. You can purchase those, and of course that helps keep that website going, right? That just goes back in to help funding what we do there. It's almost a zero-sum game for us. But we do it to try to make sure that you can get that content and it's available for you. Also, you can download the free mobile app. Just go to your app store, wherever you get your app on your smart device, and just look for Abbeville Institute, and you can download the app, and of course you have the Abbeville Institute on the go then. You can shop at Amazon with Amazon Smile. We are an Amazon Smile approved 501c3, so if you make the Abbeville Institute your preferred Amazon Smile nonprofit, every time you shop at Amazon, we get a couple of pennies out of it. So it's a great way. We've actually made some money on that. So people that use Amazon Smile, you're helping the Institute painlessly because you're already shopping at Amazon anyways. Of course, you can also click on the shop tab at abbevilleinstitute.org. You can get our logo and all kinds of cool stuff, high quality embroidered material. It's a great way to advertise for the Institute. And as always, share our material around on social media. We are back on Facebook, that we're not advertising it too much yet. We're just going to see how that plays out. But we are back on Facebook, so you can share our material around there. You can also share it on any other social media network and let people know you like it. Also, rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Give it that 5-star review. Comment on our podcasts and our other videos on YouTube. It helps move them up the list, and people get to see them more when that happens. That's always a great thing. So the algorithm picks it up, and then people see more of our stuff. So all of these things are painless ways, oftentimes, to support the Institute. All it takes is a little activity on your part, as you're already out on social media anyways, to do these things. All right. Let's talk about the material for the week. We had a lot of good articles, I think, this week. Just some fantastic stuff. I want to start with the first piece of the week on Monday, and the Cry of the Vanquished. And it's a beautiful incorporation of literature into a discussion of the South and what the South really means to people and what it means to people who aren't from the South. You see, one of the things that the Southern tradition has, it's a timeless thing, right? It's a timeless thing, and it's also beyond borders. People enjoy the Southern tradition all over the world. It's a full expression of the conservative Western tradition and Western civilization. And so it doesn't matter if you live in the United States, if you live in Europe, and we have a lot of people that listen to this podcast all over the world. If you live in Asia, if you live in South America, if you live in, and take your pick, live in Africa, it doesn't matter. The conservative tradition advocated by the Abbeville Institute, and not just that, some of the political stuff we talk about, which of course is Calhoun. Calhoun is applicable anywhere. And Clyde Wilson used to tell me that people came into his office and talked about Calhoun from all over the world because they wanted to figure out how this concurrent majority thing would work. They were interested in what it could do for them. And even as bad as the Robert Elder book is in a lot of ways, he does talk about this at one point. Calhoun has currency all over the world because people have used his ideas to thwart bad centralized power. And oftentimes it's leftist groups that are doing this, and you can understand why. If it's a situation where they are being abused by the center, well, then Calhounian government can do that, right? The concurrent majority offers that. But one of the things that this piece gets into by Julie Payne and why I like it, she's talking about an Owen Wister novel, Lady Baltimore. If you haven't read Owen Wister, you should. The Virginian is just fantastic. But Lady Baltimore is also good. And she incorporates this and weaves it into the Mark Winchell book that was just published by Shotwell Press. And you should get that book too. And she cites this, there's this one part of the Lady Baltimore story where they're sitting there and they're having a meal, right? And there's a reading of the poem Ode for the Daughters of Dixie. And you have these two northern and southern ladies sparring, but as they read as the poem is read, there is a point where the main character looks at the woman from the south, and he understands what's happening here. He says, "We were the victors, we the North, and we had gone upon our own way with songs and rejoicing, able to forget because we were the victors. We had our victory. Let the vanquished have their memory. But here was the cry of the vanquished, coming after 40 years. It was a time which at first bewildered me. Juno had seen the war. Juno's bitterness I could comprehend, even if I could not comprehend her freedom in expressing it. But the poetess could not be more than a year or two older than I was. She had come after it was all over. Why should she prolong such memories and feeling? But my light increased as I remembered she had not written this for us, and that if she had not seen the flames of war, she had seen the ashes. For the ashes I had seen myself here in Kingsport, and had been overwhelmed by the sight 40 years later, more overwhelmed than I could possibly say to Mrs. Gregory St. Michael or anybody else." So the ashes. He'd seen the ashes, the cry of the vanquished. After 40 years, it still mattered because the ashes were still there. And the North had their songs. They're spiking the football right now when taking down monuments. And if you haven't seen, of course, the Renaming Commission has recommended taking down the monument in Arlington National Cemetery, the Confederate monument there, or at least stripping of the statue, the bronze reliefs. And this is all going to cost $62 million. Right? $62 million for this. $62 million of Southern taxpayer dollars. $62 million. And it's because they're spiking the football, because they can. Well, we won. We have our songs. We have our United States. We have these things. You are no longer even accepted as part of it. If you are someone who fully loves your Southern tradition, your lineage, whatever it is, you're just not accepted anymore. You are deplorable. You're an outsider. You're irrelevant. And that's what this piece speaks to. Now, again, Julie Payne is not from the South, but she loves the Southern tradition. She wrote that in an earlier essay for us. She says, "We are also here long after the war is over, and so why do we write? Why do we continue to share the ideas and tell the stories of the vanquished South? I submit that although it is not even possible for any of us to be acquainted with someone who witnessed the flames of this war, we too have seen the ashes. Not everyone does. Many revel in the grandeur of the empire and the progression of technology and manners which they believe are raising us to new heights of sophistication. But those of us with eyes to see have a solemn obligation to keep alive the truth and values that are nearly obliterated in today's reconstructed America. We who have enough sensitivity to feel the pain created by that conflict, and sufficient knowledge to discern the source of our present disaster, must continue to enlarge the memory of our people so that hope for a restoration remains." And this is true, right? I mean, this is why things like the Abbeville Institute exist, because of this. Now, if you are listening to this podcast, if you read the website, if you attend our conferences, then you have a charge. One of the things that we often take for granted is, or just think that should happen, is that people like yours truly, who have advanced degrees in history, and we should be the ones leading all of this. But in reality, some of the best history that's ever been written was by amateurs. People that just love the South, love the stories, and they write great histories. This is what Shotwell has done. I mean, one of the nice things about Shotwell is it goes to these people that just want to write some histories, and they do it, and so they publish the material. And Clyde Wilson has always been receptive to that. He's always been looking out, and he's always promoted and helped people that want to simply tell good stories. And so it's admirable. It's one of his admirable traits that he does that. He's very encouraging, and he's very encouraging with someone like Julie Payne or others to do these things. And so I want to encourage you through this podcast, if you're listening, send us material for the website. Even if you're not a professional historian, so what? Send it. We want your stuff. We want you to have a voice. And you have a job as a historian, whether you think you're a professional historian or not, it doesn't matter. You have a job as a historian to tell people these things. That's one of the essential charges of anybody who loves history, is to share it. Otherwise, it only enriches yourself. So you have to share it the best way you can. She later says, Mark Roden Winchell, at the end of his essay, Trashing Mount Rushmore, links the disastrous acts of presidential administrations through the last 2 centuries with their precedents in the atrocious measures enacted by Abraham Lincoln and his radical Republican cronies. One of the most dramatic examples he uses is to compare the odious treatment of Congressman Clement Vallandigham, who opposed Lincoln's unconstitutional war, with the internment of Japanese-American citizens during World War II. Without these precedents, Winchell argues, the door to subsequent assaults on freedom would have remained closed, at least for a little longer. He astutely warns, quote, once the use of extra-constitutional sanctions against American citizens is widely accepted, we cannot be certain that only the obviously guilty will suffer. And of course, we have the proof, she says. The current administration leaves us aghast with its boldness in stripping away from Americans every semblance of freedom and independence promised in the Constitution as it was presented to the states. It cannot be disputed that the principles so passionately advocated by men like Patrick Henry lie in ashes at our feet. I have seen the ashes, and like Winster, am more overwhelmed than I can say. Will the South ever rise again? What really needs to happen is, of course, the South, as Jefferson Davis points out, and she also cites Jefferson Davis, the South was simply just a full expression of things that were considered American for many years, right? A generation and many decades. That was it. That was an expression of what Americans recognize as truly American. The Southern position in 1861 was simply that. The Northern position was something else. And it was not distinctively American. It was power. And so the Northern position was the British position, really, in many ways. That's what it was. And Davis makes this clear throughout his works, that the Southerners were simply pushing what Americans fundamentally believed throughout much of American history, but had been forgotten by Americans by 1850 and 1860. And that's the sad part about it. So this piece is great, and Owen Wister is just a fantastic writer. If you haven't read his material, you should. But it leads into the piece that we had on Tuesday by Casey Chalk, History by Emotion. If you haven't seen this story, well, the United States Postal Service has closed down a post office because it was in an old train station that had, as historical relic, 2 entrances to the building, one white and one colored. And so apparently the post office was concerned that people wouldn't realize this was a historic building and a museum, and they would think that the post office advocated segregation. So they closed it down. Now, Chalk points out this is just where we are now. This is just absolute stupidity. He says, label me, and I presume the USPS leadership nonplussed, for if I was a government bureaucrat trying to avoid any controversy that might provoke the ire of anti-racist ideologues, I would have thought distancing a post office from any possible connection, real or imagined, to segregation would be welcomed with the appropriate woke applause. So he's saying, look, if I was a bureaucrat, we're not going to support this segregation. Moreover, it's not as if the anti-racist crowd ever tire of finding new targets. Not only have they vandalized and toppled statues, but they've pursued endless campaigns to re-Christian schools, roads, and community colleges. And imagine the derogatory headline: post office is predominantly white rural Virginia still has white and colored signs. Sure, there would be a gross misrepresentation, but if we're talking about anti-racist activist messaging, most of their claims are misrepresentation. So the thing is, one of the things that people pointed out, well, we should have this, right? I mean, some people are saying, well, this is a teachable moment. We should have this. But this is the weird situation we live in. There's an inconsistent messaging. So Chalk says, I can anticipate a woke retort. In a museum, it's acceptable to feature artifacts from the Jim Crow or antebellum eras, but it's verboten in public places where one might interpret the artifacts as honoring the legacy of segregation, slavery, the Confederacy, etc. But even the post office example, those lines weren't perfectly clear. A federal office was located in a building with segregationist signage out front. That aside, the delineation still doesn't hold. There are people regularly attacked by the anti-racist mob for doing things as innocent as handing a black child a piece of cotton during a tour of the Virginia governor's mansion. He says, we're living in strange times, in which even public schools named after Thomas Jefferson and George Mason have been renamed because of their association with slavery. Earlier this year, the Washington Post published an op-ed calling for George Washington University to be renamed. And he says, an overwhelming majority of prominent American historical figures in one way or another are implicated in some way in segregation or slavery. Cities, counties, schools, streets, public buildings all venerate men that the liberal academy and media now detest as perpetuating the patriarchy and white supremacy. Anyone who resists this obsession with anti-racism, no matter how strong their credentials within liberal institutions, risks their reputation and career. So, I mean, this is his point. We live in strange times. Even someone like James Sweet, who we talked about, president of the American Historical Association, who said, look, presentism is a danger. He had to go on bended knee before the woke mob because he pointed out the truth. This is where I mentioned before, just a few minutes ago, where Clyde says we need the non-academics to write history because you're not tied into the academy and all the problems with the academy. It's not something you worry about. You're not worrying about promoting your career or getting a tenure position or anything else. You can just write what you want to write, and it can be really good history. Now, you're not going to get an academic press to publish it, but you can find places like Shotwell to do it. And people are more receptive to this now than ever before. You can get your material published on the Abbeville Institute website. Send it to us, right? So we can look at it and see if we want to publish it or not. He says, in an ideological climate like this, no one should be surprised that the Postal Service sought to distance themselves from a historical artifact that could potentially be used as a cudgel with which to beat any white males currently in its senior leadership. America does its history via emotion, not reason or reverential humility towards our patrimony. Even the word patrimony is a bit too patriarchal, don't you think? Now, that's important, that idea of emotion. This is very important, history through emotion. Emotivism is a powerful thing, and it's based on Yankee self-righteousness, right? It's all moral decisions are now emotional decisions, and of course that leads to political decisions. And so this is how we govern American society. Emotivism. It's dangerous. These statues are coming down not because they actually represent a real threat to anything. This is emotional response to these things. Oh, that hurts my feelings. I can't look at that because it hurts my eyes. It hurts my feelings. I think about all these horrible things. Get over yourself. Right? I mean, this is just stupid. But it's where we are. I mean, emotivism is a stupid way to govern a society. So we're going to spend millions of dollars, $62 million, to do all these things for the federal government, to rename military bases and take down statues and change street names and change stamps and all kinds of stuff. And, of course, states have already spent millions of dollars taking down statues, while all the real issues in America aren't being addressed. But we're going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars doing this when it's all said and done. Hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars. And all of the issues remain. Nothing has gotten any better in American society. Crime is still bad. In fact, crime is worse. We still have all the other issues that we deal with in society. But we don't have to look at that statue anymore. This is how stupid this is. He says there's no rational retort to accusations of racism in a paradigm defined by emotivism, as Alasdair MacIntyre expertly explained in his epical 1981 book, After Virtue. In a society that has jettisoned a coherent conception of reason in favor of sentiment, the only acceptable response to such an accusation is more only more intense emotive counter-assertion. Hence the risible character of so many contemporary controversies where people seek to outmaneuver each other to secure, quote, most victimized status, which counterintuitively means you achieve the most accolades and opportunities. See the celebration of pseudo-historian Nicole Hannah-Jones. The editorial board of the Washington Post called on the Postal Service to reverse its decision regarding the little post office in rural Virginia, demanding the USPS squarely face history. Yet the methods and narratives our elite institutions now employ to do history is anything but square. It is a confounding mess, an impenetrable maze, and an intellectual straitjacket from which even well-meaning white liberals cannot escape, based as it is not on the search for truth and a deferential respect for the past, but politicized grievance against power structures. Does it even matter what the Postal Service does? Either way, the ideologues will call it racist. This is a fantastic piece. Right? I really like this piece, and I'm glad that Casey Chalk writes for us at times because he does a good job of these kind of things. History by emotion. That's what we're doing nowadays, and it's bad history. It's bad history. There's no doubt about it. So these two pieces, I think, were just outstanding contributions this week at the Institute. And we had other good stuff. I mean, we had a nice piece by Ronnie Kennedy. Again, anytime the Kennedys get to write for us, that's always fun because they're so passionate about what they do. I mean, look, if there's any two men, Ronald and Donald Kennedy, who have done such a fantastic job throughout their lives to promote, often unselfishly, the importance of the South and the Southern tradition, it's these two men. I mean, The South Was Right changed the way people thought about the South. That book, which has sold hundreds of thousands of copies, it's just fantastic. Came out in the early 90s, right about the time people needed it. And I've told this story before, how when I was an undergraduate in college, it was about that time, and they published Why Not Freedom. And I read that book first. And I thought, well, this is it. I mean, now at first, here I am. Most people start in, if they're conservative, they start in this way. I read the Washington Times. I would go religiously, sit in the library and get the Washington Times and read it. And I subscribed and got it and cut out the editorials and did stuff like that. And I wrote the college newsletter to get circulated around the campus and things like that. And I read this book, and I remember I was a little bit shocked about their conclusions in that we need a nullification or perhaps even secession to deal with these things. Because that was something alien to me. It was something that I had never heard before. And so, but I started really thinking about it. No, this makes sense. I mean, if we really are talking about federalism here, well, then shouldn't we really talk about federalism? And then I read, of course, The South Was Right. That was the second book I read by the Kennedy brothers. And, of course, all that led me to go to work with Clyde Wilson down in South Carolina, and the rest is history. But this has happened to so many people because of the Kennedys. And, people like Julie Payne who just come across the website, or they come across the Institute somewhere, the podcast, or one of our lectures on YouTube. And they're captivated. They're fascinated by it. Well, how these people are saying things we don't often hear, right? We don't hear this stuff. This is strange. This is not something that we've heard before. And so they get into it and they read it. And then I think as you read more history, particularly the side of the Jeffersonians, you see that a lot of this makes sense. I mean, this is America. When Davis talks about the fact that Southerners were simply advocating what Americans had thought for decades before 1861, he's not saying anything that's not true. This is all true. And so that's what attracted me to that position. Well, I mean, they're not saying anything that, say, Thomas Jefferson didn't say, or, even Timothy Pickering didn't say, right? So, I mean, you have this continuity between the founding generation and 1860, and then somehow we forget it. That we shouldn't forget it. Davis makes clear at one point, well, I mean, it seems to be that we're in a situation where the North has won. But he said the sword never made the Southern position wrong. It just made it impracticable. That's important. The Southern position was never proved to be wrong, just impracticable. And not only that, he said, look, we can all love the Union again only if it maintains the rights of the states. And what do we see every day from the central authority? And of course, this is where Kennedy's piece, Biden's political slavery, gets involved in this. Right? He talks about the Biden speech that he made in front of Independence Hall in the Pennsylvania State House, and the optics of it, right? The all-powerful federal government, centralized power, all these things, and he brings in history. Colonial patriot Josiah Quincy would have been shocked to see an American president flanked by his military delivering a harsh and threatening political speech. Quincy warned, quote, "The history of mankind affords no instance of successful and confirmed tyranny without the aid of military forces." And these are Northerners. See, this is what I'm saying. Northerners. He's not using Southerners. He's using Northerners. This is what Jefferson Davis pointed out. We were all on the same page until the 1850s. And then what happened? Well, you had people like Charles Sumner advocating for sectional aggrandizement. They wanted to make America New England again, and that's what they did. Because centralized power worked for them. And it works for the left. It doesn't really work if you're a conservative, because we're never going to control the government, right? So you've got to think about other things, and this is where the history of all this stuff becomes important, right? Not advocating anything one way or another, but these things make sense as you start to read them. It's why the Institute is important. And look, years ago, and I've mentioned this before, there was an article in Time magazine about the Maryland State Song, and the opposition to it was because it was dissident, right? It was in your face, federal government is bad. And that's why they had to get rid of it. That's why this author of this said, we got to get rid of this thing because it's dissidence. And the piece on Thursday by Valerie Protopappas is the same thing, destroying the past to change the present. Right? It's what it is. At the end of the piece, she says, for the country to fall, the South must be destroyed as a cultural and political force. Indeed, that was the whole thrust of Lincoln's War when he wrote in 1862, quote, the character of the war will be changed. It will be one of subjugation. The South is to be destroyed and replaced by new propositions and ideas. If the South is obliterated, then the New World Order will be advanced. But that won't happen as long as the South refuses to go peacefully into the dark night. Therefore, we may be sure of ever greater and more potent attacks against the symbols and heritage of the South and her people in the very near future. And this is true, right? More of this is going to come. The South is the other that needs to be expunged. Not just, look, it's not just coming from the left. It's also coming from the right. It's coming from people like Victor Davis Hanson. He attaches everything bad in America to the South. It's the boogeyman. You got to go after the South. So all of this matters. You got to get rid of that other that supposedly makes everything bad in America, even though people like Davis would say, well, I mean, this is the American tradition. This is what we always had, and we were fighting for that. And it's the other side that's been pursuing decidedly anti-American or un-American things. So I like these pieces, and of course, the last piece of the week, the Federalist Crucible, was delivered at our 2004 summer school. And it talks about how Federalists won and what that meant, this Hamiltonian American, what that meant for America. And essentially, that's what the entire thrust of the Institute is. That's why we have Tom DiLorenzo come and talk at times. It's to advance this idea that the Jeffersonian vision of America was real America for a long period of time. It was what people thought about when they thought of America. Decentralized, agrarian, suspicious of fusion of government, banking, finance, suspicious of standing armies. This was real America. And we've lost that, and actually what we've embraced is Hamiltonian America, which was something entirely different from what the founding actually was and what the majority of Americans at the time thought about. And so anytime you go to our summer schools and you listen to lectures, this is what you're going to get. And of course, you can get these things on the mobile app. We have all the audio files of these. Plus, we've got them on the website. Plus, many of them, particularly in the last few years, are available on YouTube in video form, so you can get them there too. We have so much good content, so many things. There are over 3,000 posts now on the Abbeville Institute website. There are hundreds of lectures, I think over 200 now. We've got the Abbeville U videos. We're close to a dozen of those. I mean, we have so much good content. Let me just say this again. We're getting to the end of the year. So if you really like the Institute and you want to see all this stuff continue for the foreseeable future, then consider that donation. We can only do it with your financial support. All of this stuff, even me being here, it costs money. So we have to do that. We have to have contributions to make these things happen. So if you love the Institute, consider that donation. All these other think tanks, whether it's the Claremont Institute, Heritage Foundation, a lot of other these big quote-unquote conservative think tanks have much more resources than we do, and particularly those on the left and the SPLC and other groups. They have tremendous amounts of resources. We're on a shoestring budget most of the time. And so, we could do more with more money, but it always takes money. All right. Hope you enjoyed this week at the Abbeville Institute. Until next time, good day.